Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your host, Nina. I have been busy for the past few weeks, and that's because I have basically unretired. And that means I am going to be debating again. I'm going to be ad scoring again. I'm planning to do a bunch of judging again. And basically, it's just been a very hectic time. Besides relaunching the podcast, I have really gotten back into serious debate training. I have been doing a bunch of spars. I have been judging more. I am now much more active and deliberative in my coaching. Not that I never was. I think I was always active and deliberate. It's just my mindset had to change a little bit as well as I started thinking about making sure I was improving too. Because I'm so used to teaching like the younger kids, right? So recently, I also went to review some of my old episodes. Now, I didn't do those actively. I didn't listen to everything. There's quite a lot. And also, I would cringe at myself because my mic back then and my editing skills were not the way they are now. I'm not saying my editing skills are any good now either, but they're just way worse before. But basically, I realized how different my style is now compared to back then, especially episode one. So, episode one, if you are in the debatable lore, and again, we launched 6 years ago, so I don't really expect you to. 6 years ago, I launched an episode about prep steps and basically how I get ready for a round once the motion is released. And I was listening to it. I even looked back at my old episode script and I realized I don't agree. I don't agree anymore with a lot of the things that I said there. Doesn't mean old me was wrong. Not really. I want to clarify that there are different styles for different people. You're going to encounter different ways of debating based on who it is that you talk to. In fact, you might even encounter different styles of debating within the same person based on how much they've changed, based on the circumstances, maybe even based on the topic. So, in my case, it was years of changes and years of training, and especially years of becoming a more deliberate and active coach in the scene. And so, I wanted to give you a little bit of the rundown of the things that I consider now when I am looking through a motion or if I am preparing for a round. This is in relation to the previous episode. So if you have not seen that, I suggest that you do because a lot of the ways I debate now are in relation to pathfinding as well as making flowcharts of a debate. And the reason that is because I managed to visualize debates a little bit better. Now, back then, I'll admit a lot of my debating was run on pure intuition. It's actually quite a miracle that I managed to get the credentials I did back then, running on very loose rules and mere guidelines. Now, I think a lot of people do survive this way. I think a lot of people are the type that thrive on like making use of their intuition. But the thing is, and sadly, not everyone will have that kind of intuition. It is not accessible to everyone. And so when I started coaching, I really had to keep that in mind because my explanation of things would not easily translate to someone who probably does not have the same way of thinking as me. So take everything I say now as well with a grain of salt. Of course, I have done my best to make sure I am like fixing things as much as possible so that people can understand, but that's just not how it works. So that's the first part of this episode, right? I just needed to tell you one, there are multiple styles that exist. Two, I have significantly changed the style that I have. Three, I am back in the circuit. So let's go right into the main thing that you clicked this for, which is talking about my new mindsets in preparation time. Now, my new mindset in preparation time comes in three steps. The first step is to know what kind of mindset to be in the first place, or at least know how I should be thinking. Now, this feels kind of unintuitive because shouldn't you already be thinking in preparation time? But I want to say not necessarily because sometimes when you enter into discussions, your goal is not to win everything. Your goal is to find out the most strategic things to win. So, for instance, if I were to enter a preparation time now with a motion, I would first look at the different paths that one can take to win. So, for instance, if I want to talk about banning smoking, there is the path where I talk purely about the ban and how logistically it happens. There's also the route where I just demonize smoking. There's also the route where I have to perhaps talk about what the world would be like if people did not smoke and how banning is just the best way for us to do that or get that kind of world. So, by identifying three different paths, I now have a better picture of the possible places that debate will go to. Will those directions or paths always come into fruition? But it is worth identifying what they are. Because the next thing that you're going to do is you have to select the path that you want to take or the road that you think is going to be useful to you. Now, you can take multiple, but you also have to get ready for some of the roadblocks that will come your way. So, for example, if I wanted to talk about why the band would be good, then I need to prepare myself because I know somewhere down that road, my opponent is going to start questioning how effective the ban will be. They're going to start questioning why it's even fair for a ban to exist, why it's justified, how do you make sure other people won't get hurt. So when you pick a path, you are already anticipating the entire road ahead. Similar to other directions that you can take. So, for instance, if I wanted to talk about the benefits of not smoking, which for me personally is not the main issue of the debate, that's more of like a secondary thing that you can have because, I think you can still run that smoking is bad without a ban happening. But that's besides the point. The point is when you start justifying a benefit or an outcome, then I also have to start anticipating that down that road, I'll have to prove why that benefit is exclusive to banning, why that can only exist in this way, all of that. So that's the first thing. I'm going to do path identification and path selection. I'm going to choose which one is the most strategic for me. Now, as a first speaker, and I'm a career first speaker, I've done a lot of deputy and whipping back in my day, but if I were to choose, I really love being a first speaker. The last step that I would do during this is to start creating that road. So we've just identified it. The job of the first speaker is to lay out as many of the foundations as they can, as early as they can as well. So that brings us to part two. In prepping, you also need to keep in mind not only that you're there to identify the paths, to select them, and to build them, you also need to know what each speaker role is supposed to do. Now, for the purposes of, I'm going to talk about this as if it is an AP, so Asian parliamentary. A lot of this advice is also good if you are debating in the British parliamentary format as well as the World Schools format. After a while, you will know that all the formats have their own nuances, but a lot of the skill sets at their core remain the same. That's why it's very easy for a lot of debaters to jump between different formats. But anyway, the roles that you should be taking in prep. If you are the first speaker, as I said, you are primarily in charge of identifying these roads as well as building them. So you should be laying down foundations and you should be making a lot of these roads functional. The reason why you're not meant to really build everything to completion. That's why you have the rest of your team with you. The reason, though, that you have to do a lot if you are a first speaker, which is both the beauty and the challenge of it, is because you want to make sure you are laying out everything that needs to be there so that once your deputy speaker or your member speaker or your whip speaker comes after you, they can just pick up where you have left off. They can just use what you've already established. They can basically go wild knowing that you've already given them the go ahead or the opportunity to be able to go down that path. So that's the overpowered nature of a first speaker. I truly believe that framing is such an underrated skill, and I will probably do an episode on that one next because It is in framing and contextualizing a debate properly and giving it the correct definitions, being able to supply the best kinds of model. You are actually not only laying down a lot of the different roads that your team can take, you are also blocking other roads that your opponent might want to take instead. But of course, more details on that in the future. So that's the first speaker. The extension speakers here, I feel your job is to really defend these roads. So, assuming your first speaker has already started going down that path, proving, for example, that a ban is justified, your goal is to reinforce it. Your goal is to make sure if there were attacks, if there were responses, if there were rebuttals, that either you correct what was wrongfully assumed of your side and therefore avoid their rebuttal from even coming into light, or if the rebuttal that they've given is justified or there is some strength behind it, then you have to find something else that will reinforce it. Maybe look into the long term. Maybe you can even agree that some harms will happen. It's just that you know it's worth it. Or you are willing to do that because it leads to something better in the long run. So when we say defend the path, there are many ways for you to do that. But you have to at least keep in mind that your goal as a deputy or a member, you're not always meant to bring something new to the table. I feel like that's a misconception. And I know a lot of the manuals now in British parliamentary, even in Asian parliamentary and world schools, they say explicitly now that as long as you are adding value to the debate, you are not required to have new content necessarily. Because the value you could be providing is reinforcing an idea of your teammate. You could be extending on the logic. You could be providing more evidence. You could be providing more impacts. All of these things, in my book at least, are still considered part of your role and should not mean that you get less of a score. So if you have to give up an entire argument just so you could shield everything correct that your first speaker has done, I think you should. It's also, and this is a side note now, you might still want to know the difference between the deputies and members. So, deputies are the second speaker for opening half of BP rounds. Members are the first speakers of the closing half of a BP round. And on paper, they functionally have the same job. They're meant to add new value, extend the debate. Member speakers for me function a little bit more like first speakers. Or I think the main opponent of a member speech is not the deputy of the opening half. It is more the first speaker of the opening half. Because your job is to reframe the debate. Your job is to hijack as many of the roads as you possibly can without it being a complete rehash. It is also your job to basically frame and weigh why your angle is going to be more important. So, deputies, I feel, at opening do a little bit more of whipping. Specifically, they are locking down the roads and making sure that this is the most optimized road ever in the round. We'll talk more about that later because that's more of a whip job, right? But the member, I think, is focused more on extending the roads that already exist. They can do it for three ways, or in three ways, at least like what I've written here. The three ways are they can either start from a different start point altogether, which means they give a new frame, and therefore the argument direction can be a little bit different or slightly different from the opening half. The second is maybe they agree with the frame and they start from the same point, but they might be overriding the roads built by the opening half, which means if we are viewing debates like flowcharts and finding paths, you're basically saying that we agree with this path, they just missed out on a lot of stuff. So you could be the team that substantiates, that mechanizes, that gives more reasons for why the argument of your opening half is true. I think that if I were to use this strategy, I would be very careful with it because it runs the risk of sounding very similar unless you can actively point out why the added things that you are giving or the mechanisms that you are providing are crucial for the round or that they are heavy enough that it should mean you take away credit from your opening team. Unless you can do those things, I would advise against this strategy because it is quite hard to pull off. The third strategy you could do is Maybe you agree with the frame as well as some of the arguments, you just want to bring it to a different conclusion. So you might be impacting it differently. You are hijacking a frame, but you are pointing out how it affects a grander scheme of things or more long term thing, or maybe a different group of actors altogether. So that's the main difference, I think. If you are a member, you have the added job of basically, I wouldn't say it's knifing. Knifing is actively calling out and attacking your opening. You're just trying to show them up. You're trying to be a little better than them. You're trying to agree, but kind of underhandedly showing the judge that you have it better figured out. It's a strategic game, right? So that's the extension speakers and the mindset that they should have when they are prepping. Finally, for the whips, during prep time, there is a misconception that you're not doing anything. You should be doing something. Please do something, right? Help your first speaker, help your second speaker figure out the directions the debate can take. And as early as possible, as a whip, you should be knowing what are the roads that are most strategic for your team. You should also see what road do you think is going to lead you to the victory. In fact, I learned that there is a new meta now where everyone says paths to victory, which is great. I think that's a great way for me to re enter the scene given how I view things with the flowchart. But I think that is the best explanation as well of what the whip does. They identify everything that has already happened in the debate, and during prep time, you try to anticipate as many of it as possible because by the time you have to give your speech, it's not your job to say that no other road is viable or that everything that they've said is unrealistic. Because at a certain point, you will have to engage. And the ultimate form of engagement is showing why, even if those roads exist, we'd rather take this path, or we'd rather show that this is actually the best way to get to the outcomes we all want. So, as a whip, you have to lock down the path. You have to also defend the path if there are like stray attacks or responses that you need to deal with. But most importantly, I feel like you have to run down the path. As the whip speaker, your first speaker and second speaker have done a lot of legwork to make sure that a lot of the arguments have some meat, that they are chunky, that they are viable, that they are realistic, that they are very grounded. As the whip, if you could, you have to explain really quickly by running down that entire road what it is that your teammates were able to contribute, as well as how does this argument therefore become the most direct path to proving the main debate. If you are able to do all of those things, even as early as prep time, if you have like the ability to kind of anticipate a lot of the angles and arguments of your opponent, then all of these factors combined as a team will almost guarantee you like a good position. Of course, it won't guarantee a win. There are many factors in the debate, but it is already a big leg up. I think people address prep as it just being a game of improving as an individual. And that is true. For a long time, that is how I approach debating. But the thing is, when you start working heavily in the circuit and with teams, and you are a coach like me, you'll realize that team dynamics aren't just there for fun. They are there because they are really what make a team function. So, when you are preparing, not only is it important to know what your job is, you also need to know how is your speech going to exist in relation to others as well. So that's some of the ways that my prep style have changed. I am a lot more explicit when I am preparing with my teammates now. I am much more verbal about my intentions. I also make sure that we are on the same page because there's a tendency before where I would write something down assuming that everyone can already see what I want done with it. So, for example, a piece of model or one prong in my policy that I'm expecting later can be blown up into a completely new benefit. I realize that people don't see the debate the same way I do, the same way I don't see the debate the way they do. So it becomes my responsibility to be very explicit about what I want to be done with these little pieces of material that I'm bringing up as a first speaker. And of course, I need to be debated as well during preparation time because, as much as I am rather old, it is because I am old that I am not sure if my strategies are still correct or within the meta, as people call it. But it's been fun. It feels like I'm prepping again as someone who is new in debate, but really I'm not. So I'm bringing very old school skills into a new debate circuit. Will it work out? I do not know. I just know it was a lot of fun thinking about it. It was also quite a lot of fun to review and kind of compare and contrast the ways I've been preparing and seeing debate. And that's it for this episode of Debatable. A little bit more casual in nature, I know, but I'm trying to get comfortable again with just recording and like setting up and pressing the button. So I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for listening. Bye bye.